Thank you for the invitation, Hazel, and to the delegates from Ecuador who have come such a long way and have been engaged in organizing this important process. I'm honored to be involved and appreciative of the conversation so far this morning. What I'd like to do today, in my brief time before you, is to generally talk about the place of indigenous Americans in these ongoing conversations about 21st century democracy, social justice, and sustainability, and to do so from the vantage point of the United States and North America, where we all currently are located. I do work in the field of American Indian history, and it's been 521 years since the arrival of Europeans to the Western Hemisphere, and 21 years since the 500th anniversary of the Colombian encounter, the memorialization in the late 20th century of these processes of globalization, modernity, demographic and epidemiological collapse that characterize so much of Western hemispheric history. And I think this vantage point of 21 or 20 years after the Colombian 500th anniversary gives us some vantage point for thinking broadly about how indigenous studies, indigenous affairs have, and in many ways have not been, fully recognized and institutionalized across the North American academic landscape. And so it's extremely exciting and invigorating to hear that Ecuadorian constitutional developments have taken a heavy and necessary indigenous informed and inflected emphasis, and have brought to the fore what we might generally recognize as relatively shared principles about land stewardship, sustainability, and good living that numerous indigenous populations across the hemisphere share. 20 years ago, academic institutions such as these did not generally take the intellectual inquiry into Native Americans, both in North America and often South, very seriously. And I've monitored this process throughout my academic career over the last 20 years and been relatively both inspired by the transformations that I've been witnessing, but also constantly reminded at how much kind of public discursive and academic work remains to be done to bring attention to these necessary forms of inquiry across institutions such as these. So if I were to title my presentation today, it'd be something along the lines of indigenous studies, reforming institutions of power, and the necessary requirements of academic reconciliation and resource allocation. And what I say in response to these general contours is that all of the academic efforts that have kind of led to the growing awareness of indigenous studies across the North American landscape in many ways are directly congruent with or inspired by or linked to processes of social activism and engagement by contemporary indigenous communities. Hazel mentioned the Idle No More project or movement sweeping across particularly Canadian Aboriginal communities as well as North American indigenous communities that started roughly a year ago. There have been a series partly around the Colombian encounter, the memorializations of it in the early 90s that have brought indigenous concerns before national and international communities. So we have national representatives here from the Ecuadorian government, and the United Nations has played a central part in bringing attention to the Declaration, to the rights of indigenous peoples through a recently passed UN declaration in support of the rights of indigenous peoples, commonly referred to by the acronym DRIP. The United States and Canada, New Zealand, and Australia were the last signatories to this convention that has now been passed. So how have Native communities brought these subjects to the attention of larger institutions and national governments? That's a big question, obviously, one that I can't really answer in its entirety, but can say that in specific places, Native groups have helped to decenter the often elision or erasure of Native peoples from the national histories, national communities, and visions of the nation per se. And it's great to hear that Ecuador recognizes, I believe it's the 14 or 15 national indigenous communities therein, and very few American citizens are fully aware of the 560 plus Native American, Alaskan Native, and Native Hawaiian communities who have distinctive legal representation and recognition by the United States government. And scholars such as myself who work in this field of American Indian studies are attempting to generate and obviously redress such kind of often pedagogical omissions that have characterized so much of the public educational processes in the United States more broadly. By exposing attention to the indigenous peoples of the United States and indigenous peoples worldwide, we do, I think, raise critical concerns about the discourses of development and globalization that are upon us. Steve's wonderful kind of overview of Ecuadorian immigration and migration to the United States and globally raises the question of where do indigenous Ecuadorians find ways of maintaining, sustaining, and/or expanding their own conceptions and practices of indigeneity. Do they speak Quechua in the United States? I know they do and are involved in various indigenous rights movements here that then force us in the United States and North America to think globally about our indigenous compatriots across both the hemisphere and globe in general. And this emergent field of Native American and indigenous studies that I referenced earlier really has kind of taken institutional form in the 21st century. So one of the clear kind of what we would call in the field of American historical inquiry historiographical currents, or one of the clear intellectual movements of the last decade of scholarly inquiry has been identification of, if not full reckoning with, this dispossession, encounter, and ultimately ongoing legacies of colonialism between the United States and its indigenous subjects. A kind of intellectual movement that has actually gained much greater currency and momentum in Canada, our northern neighbor, which has recently established a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the commissioner of whom, Justice Maurice Sinclair, an Aboriginal judge from the Canadian Western province of Saskatchewan, will be keynoting our Gilder Lehrman conference on Indigenous enslavement and incarceration this coming November, for a big plug for one of our efforts here on campus. So in the United States and Canada, over the last 10 and 20 years, growing attention has been provided to the state and nature of Native American and Aboriginal or Indigenous affairs. This academic field now has journals, it now has an international association, which Yale co-hosted a couple years ago at one of our congruent local Connecticut indigenous nations, the Mohegan Nation. This movement is trying to fulfill the mandate of doing Native American or North American indigenous studies with its global counterpart of indigenous studies. We take that challenge seriously, though can often very rarely fulfill its mandate to fully comprehend the diversity of the approximately 300 million indigenous peoples worldwide. And we're struggling, and honest, to bring Latin American indigenous studies into kind of further conversation with Native American and North American, partly because of geographic, linguistic, and political differences. This has not been and an easy process, but it's a challenge like that of the ones that I began with that is showing some dividends. So it's great to hear what Ecuadorian constitutional accords are envisioning. They congruent with the efforts here on campus and across the field in general to bring heightened attention to subjects like indigenous sovereignty, indigenous reconciliation, sustainability, wellness, various kind of educational and arts activities that convey the 21st and contemporary dimensions of these subjects, that challenge the kind of historic naturalization of indigenous peoples as inherently tied to a naturalistic or historic environment, and project kind of very, very explicitly a shared of future coexistence together that disrupts kind of the teleology of American historical development that has always seen these subjects as stages of development. So I think if we can challenge the kind of developmental logic and ideology of kind of tiered forms of cultural organization, various forms of kind of political development in which indigenous peoples represent kind of anterior forms of human development or organization, the kind of anthropological models that may be very familiar to some of us in these areas, we'd be all very well served. Those 20 years have been very active and exciting kind of intellectually and politically. I Don't Know More is the kind of most recent kind of manifestation of a kind of continental activist movement around indigenous affairs that captured particularly Canadian national attention last year. The next 20 years, we hope, will be equally rewarding and insightful and may yield the kind of fulfillment of this kind of broader vision that I identified to really create institutions, associations, and kind of intellectual frameworks for really being able to fully comprehend not just Native American or Northern Native American or North America's indigenous studies, but a global field as well. And to that end, let me also plug the creation here on campus of a Native American Cultural Center, which has opened this fall and will be formally dedicated by our president this coming November. A standalone autonomous cultural center like the other 4 ethnic cultural centers on campus. It's been a 20-year struggle, speaking of 20-year anniversaries, since the Native American students here created their first kind of organized student association. 20 years after, there's now a standalone cultural center expressly designated for the Native American student community here. And those who work very closely with this center are trying and will likely very quickly also expand its parameters to include not only Native American but indigenous peoples from across the globe, with the expressed intention of welcoming, nurturing, and providing space for self-identified indigenous peoples from all across both the hemisphere, Commonwealth, and international communities. So it's nice to think that those developments are possible, but let me just conclude by saying such developments clearly and inherently do not come without sustained both activist struggle and commitment, both from or across the range of community members, political and academic leaders, and various institutional organizers. Not only don't they come without struggle, they certainly don't come with concomitant commitments of actual resources. And so the idea of working towards certain kind of utopic, we talked about this morning, various kind of obviously Republican-orientated forms of social democracy and environmental justice, I think necessarily has to include a kind of strategic, often identification and or expressly designated allocated form of resources to maintain or achieve the types of vision that we all may be working towards in often obviously very different places and environments. Thank you very much. I look forward to our conversations hereafter.